And in that sense, I think that we see the Carney government, if you want to use a word like internalizing, I think it's sort of fair, internalizing this view of the state that says the state isn't really there to improve our collective lives in any sort of general sense. What we should expect the state to do is sort of grease the wheels of the capitalist train or something like this. And beyond that, I don't think that the Carney government sees all that much value in the things that the state does.
Welcome to Perspectives, a Canadian journal of political economy and social democracy. I'm Clement Nokos, editor of Perspectives Journal and director of policy at the Parkland Institute. In the summer 2025 issue of Perspectives Journal, which you can now find in print and online, University of Calgary postdoc and Parkland Institute board member Mack Penner wrote an article entitled Carney and the Calgary School, or Passive Revolution, and Canada's Social State in the Neoliberal Era. Penner traces the origins of Prime Minister Mark Carney's economic thinking to the Calgary School, which he describes as an informal grouping of conservative academics that played an active and a significant role in influencing Canadian politics during the 1990s and 2000s, whose members centered around the University of Calgary. What united otherwise disparate neoliberal and neoconservative thinkers at the Calgary School was a skeptical orientation towards the intentional state. Carney, a lifelong banker in the financial investment sector, then the monetary central banking sector, thus stands quite appropriately as an heir to North American neoliberalism. But to secure his troubled inheritance with impressive stealth, he has become the new political face of an ideological orientation that shares his Western Canadian background, but none of his partisan identifications. Strange and contradictory as it seems, Carney arguably represents the commonsensification of a conservative tradition identified with the Calgary School, a now multi-generational group of conservative intellectuals, of which none would appreciate the association with the Liberal government. To better understand this connection between Carney and the Calgary School, I'm joined by Mack Penner. Thank you for chatting with me on the Perspectives Journal podcast.
Thanks, Clement. Very good to be here with you.
So, the Calgary School to me seems like some sort of CanCon invention, a sort of lesser-known school of conservative thought, localized for the Canadian context, and compared to more impactful schools like the Chicago School, which promulgated neoliberal thought around the world. Today, at the time of recording, is September 11th. And in 1973, on this day, we saw the coup in Chile against the Salvador Allende socialist government that brought in the Pinochet dictatorship, who also then brought in the Chicago Boys to implement a neoliberal economic regime in that country for decades. You also have the new left intellectualism of the Frankfurt School, which informs a lot of the thought we have in today's social democratic discourse. You call it something of an informal grouping of conservative academics based out of the University of Calgary, but could you speak more to what the Calgary School was? Is this actually something distinct from the Chicago School, which also espoused seemingly similar beliefs and political influence?
Yeah, so I think this will be really helpful to sort of sort through the way that the Calgary School sits alongside these other, probably more famous, arguably more impactful schools. So just in the first place, to do some sort of biographical introduction for the Calgary School. When I talk about the Calgary School, I'm really talking principally about a core group of 5 academics, all of whom worked at the University of Calgary. They started arriving there as early as the late 1960s, but they sort of started to make noise such that they were noticed by the Canadian public, figures in media, and so on, as of the early 1990s. And so probably their most active decade is this period from the early 1990s through to the early 2000s, when the conservative movement sort of comes back together again in Canada after it splintered in the 1980s as the Reform Party rose. And so this core group of 5 consists in the first place of 4 political scientists. These names will be familiar to people who followed Canadian politics in the last several decades. So the political scientists are Barry Cooper, Tom Flanagan, Rainer Knopf, and Ted Morton. And then rounding out the group of 5 is a historian, David Bergeson. So that's sort of the core group. These are the people or the personnel that I'm talking about if I talk about the Calgary School. And so you're right to sort of suggest that it's at least worth asking the question as to whether the Calgary School deserves to sit alongside these other schools. So let's sort of just take analogous schools that we associate with right-wing politics as a way to do this. So if you think back, say, to the early 20th century and something like the Austrian school, you have a school of economics which is associated with the marginal revolution in the way that people did economics. And so the theme that's going to sort of come up here if we run through these schools is that for whatever reason, right-wing politically associated schools tend to be schools of economics. So it's true of the Austrians. If you take the Freiburg school or the German ordoliberals, as they're often called, they're associated with a kind of economic constitutionalism. If you go to the States and take the Virginia school, perhaps, again, associated with public choice theory as developed by James Buchanan at the University of Virginia. And then the same is true, of course, of Chicago. It's a little bit more difficult with Chicago to talk about like a really particular kind of contribution to professional economics, just because of the way that the Chicago School is now this multi-generational formation with extensive sort of influence in US and even global politics, as you've already alluded to. But even so, if we were going to talk about the Chicago School, we would probably just highlight something like neoclassical economics and the privileging of the free market in the way they did economics. And so none of this is possible with the Calgary School in the first instance, because again, the Calgary School is not a school of economics. It's principally a school of political science. You'll even hear people refer to the Calgary School of Political Science as a sort of more specific way to talk about the Calgary School. So what the Calgary School needs in order to sit sort of in a worthy kind of way alongside these other schools is some sort of shared fundamental orientation. And I think as it happens that they actually did have that. So the way that I like to talk about this is to say that the Calgary Schoolers shared in their critique of the intentional state. This idea of an intentional state is an imposition that I put upon them. It's not something that they ever talked about themselves, but I think that it does sort of get at the way that the Calgary Schoolers thought about the state, which is sort of the key thing that I think held the group together. So then in a nutshell, if you like, the intentional state or an intentional state is any state that acts in the service of preconceived outcomes or goals. So just as a way to sort of give some examples, a state that sets about to reduce economic inequality, or a state that would concern itself, say, with race-based affirmative action, or a state that wants to address some sort of gender imbalance or a lack of parity, say in gender pay equity or something like this. All of these kinds of things would be examples of intentional state action, the likes of which the Calgary Schoolers would oppose. And it's also, I think, worth saying that the Calgary Schoolers themselves don't come to this viewpoint in identical ways. So they train sort of in different traditions and inherit this way of thinking in somewhat different ways. So this is kind of an alliance of fellow travelers, if you like, rather than ideologically identical thinkers. So in the case of the older, just to talk about the political scientists in the Calgary School for now, in the case of the older two, so that's Tom Flanagan and Barry Cooper, they really come to this most of all through what we could call the neoliberal intellectual tradition. Both of them were very influenced by a political philosopher called Eric Voegelin, who's not that well known. But especially in the case of Flanagan, it's worth talking about the influence of Friedrich Hayek, who is much better known, sort of known to be this paragon of the neoliberal intellectual movement. And reading Hayek, Flanagan in particular gets a critique of what Hayek called constructivism, or the constructivist state. Hayek made this very famous, especially to the wider public, when he published a book called The Road to Serfdom in 1944, I believe, in which he argued effectively that any state that acted in these kind of intentional ways, again, he wouldn't have used this formulation of the intentional state, but effectively he describes an intentional state and then says any state doing that is a state on the road to totalitarianism, or something like this. And of course, that became sort of a well-known Cold War critique of the left from the right. And so something like constructivism and Hayek is where Flanagan gets this. The younger two political scientists in the Calgary School, Knopf and Morton, train in rather a different kind of context. Both of them trained at the University of Toronto in the 1970s with a couple of expatriate Straussian political scientists. Alan Bloom is the better known of the two. Walter Burns was the other one. Both of them had trained in Chicago with Leo Strauss at the University of Chicago. And Strauss, again, was a very sort of famous political philosopher, sort of known like a father of sorts in the neoconservative movement. And Strauss, for his part, would have lamented the quest to implement a simply rational society. So like excess rationalism or something would be the way that Strauss would make a similar point to the one that Hayek made, and that, of course, in these later decades, the Calgary School made in a Canadian context. And then it's also kind of, just to sort of finish this account of what the Calgary School critique of the intentional state looked like, it manifested in a way that I call antisocial, a kind of antisocial statism, because in practice, this is a way of thinking about the state that was marshaled against the post-war welfare state or the social welfare state as it developed in Canada. So the Calgary School view of Canadian history in the 20th century is one that sees things going roughly fine until, say, 1945 and the end of the Second World War. And there are lots of paradoxes that come up here, so we could talk about this all day long. But in any case, they see sort of a declinist or declensionist narrative from 1945 as that welfare state grows in the post-war years. And as of the 1990s, they're saying, all right, enough of this. It's time to sort of leave this way of thinking about the state behind and do something new. And then finally, just to address the first part of your question about whether or not the Calgary School is a CanCon invention, I think that's totally fair to put it in that way. And in some sense, the Calgary School had to be sort of named into existence in Canada in order for it to sort of take on this meaning or status that we ascribe to it now. So there it's worth saying that it was in like the late 1980s when a guy called Ralph Hedlund is sort of floating this idea that something like the Calgary School exists in the Alberta Report, which is a conservative news magazine based in Alberta. But then this idea that, there's really something going on in Calgary becomes much better known to the Canadian public in January of 1992, when Jeffrey Simpson, a journalist and a columnist in the Globe and Mail, publishes an article that says there's a Calgary mafia, his terms, active at the University of Calgary. Of course, the mafia label hasn't stuck, but certainly from that point in the early 1990s, it's been fairly commonplace to talk about something like the Calgary School.
Yeah, no, I find a group of academics taking part in organized crime is something unbelievable. Maybe a school is more apt in that description. But in any case, in your article, you also refer to the Federal Liberal Party as having succeeded in what you call a classic passive revolutionary exercise, metabolizing and representing elements of a threatening movement to ensure political survival and, as much as possible, reestablishing electoral and policy dominance. The Calgary School was something invented a few decades ago, but today, how exactly does this definition of passive revolution, referring to the Calgary School, refer now to Mark Carney's new government? Are there, for instance, recent examples of where the Calgary School might be propping up in today's news?
Yeah, so to begin here, I'll just sort of try to clarify this concept of passive revolution and the way that I use it in the perspectives piece. So passive revolution is this concept that comes to us from Antonio Gramsci, the famous Italian Marxist political philosopher. And I'm then sort of channeling it through a Canadian historian, Ian Mackay, who uses this idea of passive revolution to talk about a big chunk of Canadian history. In Mackay's case, it's used to talk about a period of a little more than a century, from 1840 to 1950, so the middle of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th. And there, Mackay wants to say that passive revolution in governance manifests as a kind of pillaging, if you like, on the part of a ruling elite, typically, of course, the Liberal Party in this country, but not always so. But a pillaging directed at threatening political movements. So in that period, from the mid-19th century to the middle of the 20th century, Mackay sees the radical democratic left as being, at least in the view of the Canadian ruling elite, the most sort of threatening political movement. Of course, we know that at times in that century, the left had a lot of political power in this country, was very appealing to a lot of people. And so that being the case, where possible, ruling elites would seek to sort of, again, pillage from that movement, incorporate aspects of its demands, but do so in a way that in the first instance kind of defangs or waters down those demands, but incorporates them to enough of a degree that you can successfully undercut or undermine the appeal of those threatening protest movements. And so then what I'm trying to suggest, or the modification I'm trying to make as I talk about passive revolution in this more contemporary context, is to say that whereas in Mackay's period, we have this passive revolutionary pillaging from the left or at the expense of the left, since the late 1980s or the early 1990s, I think it's fair to say that the most successful protest movements in Canadian politics have been movements of the right. And as such, I think that the Liberal Party, as the sort of main party in power during these years, has rightfully seen the right as the principal threat to its electoral status, its electoral dominance, however you want to talk about that. And so that being the case, rather than a Liberal Party that is taking from radical left-wing movements and trying to undercut the appeal of those, arguably, I think we have a Liberal Party that for something like 30 years now has actually been taking from more or less radical right-wing movements, incorporating aspects of their demands, aspects of their policy preferences, sometimes defanging them or watering them down, sometimes not even doing that, but in any case, along the way, undermining, at least to some extent, the appeal of those right-wing movements. The first and maybe the best example of this occurring is in 1995 with the infamous Paul Martin Liberal budget of that year, whereas 2 years before, in 1993, the Liberals campaign on various promises to sort of repudiate trends towards neoliberalization, so repudiating trends towards free trade, welfare state retrenchment, financialization, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, in 1995, they promulgate this incredibly severe austerity budget, in the process undercutting, I think, some of the appeal that threatening conservative movements might have had at the time, especially the Reform Party. And so thinking about that 1995 budget, it seems to me that it has, of course, we don't have the fall budget that we're expecting soon quite yet with the Carney Liberals, but it does seem to me that we can expect in 2025, 30 years on, to get quite a sort of mirror image budget. You had Angela McEwen on the Perspectives podcast recently talking about the demands that Carney has made of various ministers for extensive cuts over the next 3 years. And so I think that we expect 2025 to look an awful lot like 1995. And in that sense, I think that we see the Carney government, you know, if you want to use a word like internalizing, I think it's sort of fair, internalizing this view of the state that says the state isn't really there to improve our collective lives in any sort of general sense. What we should expect the state to do is sort of grease the wheels of the capitalist train or something like this. And beyond that, I don't think that the Carney government sees all that much value in the things that the state does. So I think that's kind of how this passive revolutionary exercise is working in the last 30 or 40 years of Canadian history.
But then you also make this connection between Carney himself, you know, a central banker, previously the governor of the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, coming from this supply side monetarist tradition. That's where I would think to make this connection between Carney's outlook, the economic paradigm that he follows, and the connections to some of the folks at the Calgary School. But in your view, how does Mark Carney himself play into this Calgary School? Do you think he's been influenced by its ideas? Would you even say he considers himself a follower of its ideas?
Yeah, here I would say no. And actually, I guess the way in which I would say no is kind of important here. So while I'm not certain that Carney hasn't been influenced in some way or another by the Calgary School, I know that he is not in any way eager to like promote that influence or that relationship. And on the other end of this relationship, the Calgary School would hate to be associated with Mark Carney or the federal Liberals in any sort of way. So this would be like an offensive association to make to the Calgary Schoolers themselves, to be absolutely certain. So yeah, you're right. Carney does sort of come from this supply side tradition. Of course, he has served as a central banker alongside two conservative governments in Canada and then in the UK. But even so, I don't think that he's claiming any identification with the Calgary School. I would doubt that he had been particularly influenced, at least in a way that he was aware of, by the Calgary School. And that's kind of part of what I'm trying to say, is that some of this is happening sort of at like a hegemonic level rather than like a one-to-one influence kind of level. So that's, I guess, just to say that this fact of non-identification between these camps is actually kind of suggestive. So I think one way to read my piece is like as an account of the kind of shrinking of the ideological space in Canada in the era of neoliberalism, as both liberals and conservatives seem to have accepted, with, you know, some exceptions or qualifications that we might want to make, but accepted a view that rejects the idea of state intention, or the idea that the state can function as like an instrument for the improvement of our collective lives in particular and again intentional ways. So with the Liberals, if I could like sort of paint with a broad brush, it seems at times that the most we can expect is like kind of Band-Aid style or token gestures towards issues like economic inequality. And with the Conservatives, so of course they haven't governed in a long time. It's been, I guess, more than 10 years now since we had a Conservative government at the federal level. I think there, if they were in government, we'd reasonably expect only an intensification of market life and its associated injustices.
Keeping on that market, I mean, you borrow a bit of language from fellow Canadian academic Quinn Slobodian and his recent book from a couple of years ago now, Crack Up Capitalism. You point to the conservative crack up of the 90s that led to something of a liberal dynasty until its reformation into the modern day Conservative Party circa 2003. The same party has also gone through a number of leadership changes over consecutive minority liberal governments in the past decade. And after this decade of seeming failure, Pierre Poilievre only regaining a seat in the House of Commons this past summer with a by-election in the most secure Conservative seat in the country, people are questioning his leadership. So does that mean, in your mind, are we due for another Conservative crack-up, given the shrinking ideological space you just mentioned?
Yeah, shout out to Quinn, first of all. I hope he doesn't mind the way that I'm taking these liberties with his with his phrase. Here I would say I wouldn't rule it out. I would say maybe we could be headed for a similar sort of crack up, but actually I doubt it, and I especially doubt that it would take the same kind of intensely institutional form that the crack up of the 80s and 90s and even into the 2000s did. So that like sort of new parties, this intense factionalism, ultimately mergers and alliances. I don't think that in the near term that kind of shake up or crack up is on the horizon. And even then, I would say I kind of doubt even more generally that we'll see all that much of a crack up in the near term. So it's worth explaining why I think this is. So in the 80s and the 90s, I would say, at least in my interpretation, the precipitating events of the crack up were related most of all to a kind of Tory reticence or reluctance on important policy matters. So there, I think too many Conservatives ultimately were fed up with the inability of the Mulroney PCs to kind of step up to the proverbial plate and leave the post-war welfare state behind while embracing, say, a more ideological, a more forceful kind of conservatism as they governed. Today, I would say that Conservatives seem much more united to me, and I think that, at least for the time being, they have a sort of common external enemy in the Liberals, which to an extent I think probably limits infighting of the sort that might cause problems. Maybe, just to sort of float this idea, the Carney Liberals could prove sufficiently appealing to more moderate Conservatives, such that the Conservative Party will encounter some electoral problems. Indeed, as you sort of alluded to, maybe they already have. But I think it's very difficult to imagine that those problems would become anywhere near as acute as they were for the Mulroney PCs in 1993, who in that election it wasn't just troubles, it was complete obliteration. In 93, the Mulroney PCs won just 2 seats in the House of Commons. And so I don't see anything like that again on the near term horizon. But I do think it's also worth saying that, as far as I can tell, the direction of travel for the conservative movement these days is indeed further to the right. And global conditions being what they are, of course, with the far right on the rise in so many places, I think those conditions would seem quite hospitable to that rightward direction of travel. And so those things being what they are, I think that probably a crack up isn't in the near term outlook for Canadian Conservatives.
And just to wrap here, turning our attention to the other left side of the political spectrum, where there isn't necessarily a crack up, but the federal New Democratic Party is facing this rebuilding phase with a leadership race just recently underway. What does this Calgary School influence? You know, you've kind of described it as shrinking the available political space. What does that shrinking mean for Canadian Social Democrats, especially during this rebuilding phase? And you also see, you know, the provincial wings in Western Canada going up against the Calgary School's versions of provincial Conservatives, toe-to-toe as the only major opposition political party in places like Alberta and Saskatchewan, governing in British Columbia and Manitoba as the only other party to seemingly Calgary School influenced conservatives. How do Social Democrats confront this Calgary School influence, and what might this mean for a rebuilding federal NDP?
Yeah, this is a perfect way, I think, to follow up from the previous question. So here in the first place, I should be totally clear that I'm, of course, the furthest thing from any kind of political strategist. So that caveat should be implemented here. But I think as far as I can tell, there are basically two paths here. So with both the Liberals and the Conservatives tacking right, in one way or another, adopting something that we can sort of see as reflecting this Calgarian kind of influence. With that happening, I guess it's kind of reasonable for Social Democrats to see vacant space where the Liberals used to be and perhaps to try to fill that space. But for whatever it's worth, I think that would be a mistake. So instead, while we see these Calgarian-style politics, put it this way, normalized by the Liberals and then probably radicalized by the right-moving Conservatives, the opportunity for Social Democrats, whether at the provincial level or at the federal level, I think, is to be the political movement that rejects that politics entirely and convinces people that the state actually can be an instrument for the collective good, and that the idea of a collective good is actually something that should be thought about and then, in some measures, intentionally sought. So naturally here, of course, right-wingers, Calgarian types will call this totalitarian. They'll say Social Democrats want to walk the path to communism or something like this, and we can expect that. But for my money, I'm pretty sure that kind of Cold War mudslinging is well past its expiry date. And after 40 or 50 years now of neoliberalism, I think indeed that people are ready for a politics that offers them something different, something better. So that would be my sense of how to navigate that political terrain.
Mack Penner, where can people find more of your work?
Well, in the first instance, I have a website where you can sort of easily track down my most recent writing as it appears. So that's just mackpenner.com. You can find mostly everything that I would write there. And otherwise, how about a shout out for Active History, activehistory.ca. I'm a member of the editorial collective there, a great source for accessible historical writing with a sort of progressive slant on it. So activehistory.ca is a great place to find my work sometimes, but also the work of lots of other great Canadian historians working today.
Mack, thanks for joining us on the Perspectives Journal podcast.
Thank you for having me.
That was Mack Penner, postdoc at the University of Calgary, and author of Carney and the Calgary School, or Passive Revolution and Canada's Social State in the Neoliberal Era, which you can now read in Perspectives Journal number 4. If you like this interview, share and subscribe to Perspectives, a Canadian journal of political economy and social democracy, on all major podcast platforms, as well as Press Progress's award-winning Sources podcast that digs deeper into the news stories you won't find in the major papers. The Perspectives Journal podcast and Sources are proud members of the Harbinger Media Network, Canada's progressive podcast community. You can read more in Perspectives Journal, a publication of the Broadbent Institute, by visiting perspectivesjournal.ca, and get more from the Broadbent Institute by subscribing to our mailing list at broadbentinstitute.ca/subscribe.